Rex didn't bark. That's the thing you need to understand before any of this makes sense. In 9 years of life, through thunderstorms and strangers, and the long quiet nights when grief sat heavy in that old house, Rex had never once barked without a reason. So when Thomas Hale heard it, that low, broken sound coming from beneath the front porch at 3 in the morning, he didn't roll over and go back to sleep. He grabbed his boots. The night was the kind of dark that only exists in places where there are no streetlights, no neighbors within shouting distance, and no reason for the world to pretend it owes you anything. Thomas had moved to this part of eastern Tennessee 3 years ago for exactly that reason. He was done with the world pretending. He was 54 years old, divorced. A former high school history teacher who had buried his father, lost his marriage in the same calendar year, and somewhere in the wreckage of all that decided that 60 acres of red clay and cedar trees was a more honest companion than any person he'd ever known. The farm had belonged to a man named Earl Pratt. Earl had died in February, 6 weeks after Thomas made the offer. The real estate agent had told Thomas that Earl was the kind of man who died the way he lived, quietly, without making a fuss, without leaving much behind. That's what she said. Without leaving much behind. She was wrong. Thomas came around the side of the house with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog that had settled low across the property. Rex was at the far left corner of the porch, the old rotting lattice already torn back, his front paws buried to the wrists in the soft earth underneath. He looked up once. Just once. And what Thomas saw in that dog's eyes was not excitement the way a dog looks when he finds a squirrel or a bone. It was urgency. It was a dog telling you something is wrong. Rex, here. The dog didn't come. In 9 years, Rex had never disobeyed a direct command. Not once. Thomas crouched down in the wet grass and pointed the flashlight into the hole Rex had made. The beam swept across damp soil, old concrete blocks, a rusted pipe, and then it caught something. A corner. Straight-edged, deliberate, the kind of shape that does not occur in nature. Something had been buried there, and it had been buried on purpose. Let me tell you something about Thomas Hale that the story needs you to understand. He was not a dramatic man. He did not look for trouble, did not chase mysteries, and had spent most of his adult life believing that the quieter you kept your expectations, the less the world could disappoint you. He graded papers. He coached the junior varsity soccer team for 11 years. He made the same pot of coffee every morning and read the same section of the newspaper and thought for a long time that this was enough. And then, in the span of 18 months, his father died of a stroke at 71. His wife of 22 years told him she had been unhappy for longer than she could remember, and the school district cut his position as part of a budget restructuring that nobody voted for and everybody pretended to be surprised by. You know that feeling. Maybe not those exact losses, but you know what it is to watch the scaffolding of your life come down piece by piece and realize the building was never as solid as you thought. Thomas found the farm listing on a Tuesday night in October, sitting in a rented apartment in Knoxville with Rex asleep at his feet and nothing but the sound of traffic outside. He wasn't looking for a farm. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just clicked the link because the photo showed a porch with a view of a tree line, and something in him said, that's where you go when you're done performing. He paid $212,000 for 60 acres, a 3-bedroom farmhouse built in 1948, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a well that the inspector said was fine, but that Thomas never quite trusted. He moved in on a Thursday in March, the same week the last of the snow melted, and for the first time in 3 years he slept all the way through the night. Rex had come with the apartment, technically, a neighbor's dog who had stopped going home. The neighbor moved away without looking for him, and Thomas, who had never owned a dog in his life, simply started buying food. That was 7 years ago. Rex was a German Shepherd mix with a brown and black coat going gray at the muzzle, and he had the particular intelligence of a dog who had been on his own long enough to understand that loyalty, once given, was not something to waste. They understood each other, those two. Both a little broken, both a little wary, both somehow exactly enough for the other one. Thomas went back inside and got a garden trowel and a pair of work gloves. He told himself he was probably going to find a toolbox, or a mason jar full of old coins, or maybe nothing at all. just a shape in the soil that looked like something in flashlight shadow. He told himself this because the alternative was to admit that his dog had been trying to tell him something for weeks. Because he had been. Think back. The times you dismiss what's right in front of you because it doesn't fit what you're willing to believe. Rex had been circling that corner of the porch since the first week they arrived. Thomas had attributed it to rodents. He worked carefully, the way he'd learned to do things after 54 years of understanding that haste was the enemy of truth. Rex sat 3 feet away, completely still, watching. Not helping, just watching. As if he had done his part, and now it was Thomas's turn. The box emerged from the soil like something being born, roughly 12 inches by 8. Metal, a tin, actually, the kind that once held Christmas cookies or sewing supplies, painted green with a white lid, sealed shut with electrical tape that had dried and cracked with age. It was heavier than it looked. Thomas sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. Rex made a sound. Not a bark. Barely a sound at all. Just a low exhale, like a man who has been holding his breath and finally lets it go. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light, poured himself a glass of water because his hands were shaking slightly and he wanted to give them something to do. The tape came off in strips. The lid resisted and then gave with a soft pop. The seal of something that had been closed for a long time. Inside, wrapped in a piece of waxed cloth, a woman's gold wedding ring, 47 photographs, most of them Polaroids, a folded piece of notebook paper, and a key. The photographs were of a woman. She appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s in most of them, with dark hair cut short and an expression that Thomas could only describe as careful, the look of someone who had learned to be thoughtful about what their face gave away. In some of the pictures, she was outside, near the barn, near the tree line Thomas could see from his kitchen window. In some, she was inside this house. In this kitchen. She had stood where he was standing. There was no name on the photographs, no dates, but in the bottom right corner of one of them, someone had written 4 words in blue ink, pressed hard into the paper the way people write when they are trying to make something permanent. She was here first. The note was brief, 3 paragraphs in a handwriting Thomas didn't recognize as Earl Pratt's. He'd seen Earl's signature on the sale documents, a cramped and practical script. This handwriting was different, looser, older somehow. It said, her name was Margaret. She came to this property in 1987, and she never left in the way that mattered. If you are reading this, you found what I could not bring myself to destroy and could not bring myself to explain. The ring was hers. The key opens the cedar chest in the back bedroom. What's inside is the truth of what happened here, and I am too old and too tired and too much of a coward to tell it myself. God forgive me for leaving it for someone else to carry. It was unsigned. Thomas read it 3 times. Then he looked at Rex, who had settled by the back door and was watching him with those steady amber eyes that never seemed to miss anything. "All right," Thomas said quietly. "All right." The back bedroom had been empty since Thomas moved in. He used it for storage, boxes he hadn't unpacked, a spare mattress leaned against the wall, the quiet accumulation of things you keep because you're not ready to decide what they mean. The cedar chest sat against the far wall, half hidden behind a box of books. He had noticed it when he first moved in and assumed it was empty, assumed it had been left behind because it wasn't worth moving. He had not opened it. He wasn't sure why, now that he thought about it. Maybe because some part of him had understood, without knowing what he understood, that this was not his to open yet. The key fit. Inside the chest, arranged with a care that felt almost ceremonial, was the life of a woman Thomas had never met. Her name, as the note had said, was Margaret. Margaret Elaine Pratt, née Holloway. There was a birth certificate, 1951, Harlan County, Kentucky. A Social Security card, still in its original paper sleeve. A teacher's certification from East Tennessee State University, 1974. School photographs of a classroom Thomas could almost feel. The particular light of an elementary school in autumn. Children arranged by height, a young woman at the edge of the frame who would grow into the woman in the Polaroids. There was a marriage certificate, Margaret Holloway to Earl Dean Pratt, June 12, 1976. And there was a missing persons report filed with the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office on October 14, 1989, by one Earl Dean Pratt, reporting the disappearance of his wife, Margaret Elaine Pratt, age 38. Last seen on the property. No leads. Case status: open, unresolved. Open, unresolved. Those are bureaucratic words. What they mean, stripped down to their bones, is this: a woman walked into the world one morning and never came back, and no one ever found out why. Thomas sat on the floor of that bedroom for a long time. Rex came and lay down beside him, his warm weight against Thomas's leg, steady and unhurried. He thought about Earl Pratt, whom he had never met. A man who had lived for 30 more years on this land, after his wife disappeared from it. A man who had kept her things, not on a shelf, not displayed, but preserved. Hidden, protected, as if he were keeping them safe for someone who might eventually need to find them. Why didn't you tell anyone? Thomas thought. Why did you leave it like this? And then, quieter, the thought that followed. Or did you? Did you try, and nobody listened? He told himself he would wait until morning to decide what to do. But morning brought a truck. It pulled up to the gate at the end of Thomas's drive at 7:45. A white pickup with a magnetic door sign Thomas couldn't read from the porch. The man who got out was perhaps 60, well-built, wearing a canvas jacket and the particular expression of someone who has decided in advance that this conversation is going to go the way he wants it to go. Rex stood up from the porch step. He didn't bark. He went very still. "Morning," the man said. He introduced himself as Dale Pratt, Earl's nephew. He said he'd heard Thomas had moved in and had been meaning to come by. He said he'd heard Thomas had been doing some work under the porch. The way he said it, casual, almost offhand, like a question that was actually a statement. Thomas understood immediately that this was not a courtesy call. You've had conversations like this, where someone is telling you something without saying it, where the subtext is doing all the actual work. Thomas was a history teacher for 23 years. He knew exactly what was happening. "Found some old things," Thomas said evenly. "Tin box, photographs. Figured I'd look into it." Dale Pratt nodded slowly. He said that old properties had a way of accumulating things that didn't belong to anyone anymore. He said that family matters were private matters. He said that some things were better left where they were, especially things that couldn't be explained after so many years. He smiled when he said it. The smile did not reach his eyes. "I'd hate for your first year out here to get complicated," he said. Rex took 2 steps forward. Not aggressive, just present, just visible. Dale looked at the dog. The dog looked at Dale. Something passed between them that didn't require translation. Dale Pratt got back in his truck and left. Thomas went inside and called the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. The sheriff's department was polite and non-committal. The case was old. The detective assigned to it had retired in 2003. They would look into it, they said. Thomas should feel free to bring in anything he'd found. That night, Thomas locked the doors and set the tin box and the contents of the cedar chest on the kitchen table and went to bed at 10 o'clock, exhausted in the way that goes deeper than sleep can reach. He woke at 2 in the morning because Rex was standing on his chest, not lying, not nudging, standing. All 68 pounds of him, 4 paws planted on Thomas's rib cage, his face 6 inches from Thomas's face, his eyes locked on Thomas's eyes with an intensity that cut straight through the fog of sleep. "Rex." The dog stepped off him and moved to the bedroom door, turned back, looked at him. Thomas heard it then, what Rex had heard before him, the soft creak of the porch step, the third one, the one that always complained, under a weight that was not the wind. Someone was outside. He moved fast. The clarity that comes in those moments is something you can't manufacture and can't prepare for. It just arrives, ancient and certain, and your body knows what to do before your mind catches up. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911, set it on the nightstand without speaking, letting the operator listen. Got his boots, took the cedar chest contents and shoved them under the floorboard in the closet where the old pine had warped and left a gap wide enough. Rex stayed at the bedroom door, completely silent, completely still, watching the hallway, the sound of someone trying to open a window, then stopping, then footsteps retreating across the porch. Rex tracked the sound, his head moving slowly, precisely, like a compass needle finding north. He did not bark until the sound reached the driveway, until the threat was leaving, and then he let out one single bark, short and clear, the way you might slam a door behind someone who never should have been there. That bark. I want you to sit with that for a second. 9 years of silence, and then one sound, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. Not to attack, not to frighten, to mark the moment, to say, I know what you came for, I know what you almost did, and I am the reason you didn't. The sheriff's deputy arrived 18 minutes later. Tire tracks in the drive, a pry mark on the kitchen window frame. Dale Pratt had an alibi. His wife confirmed he was home. His alibi held for exactly 4 days, until a neighbor 2 miles down the road mentioned seeing Dale's truck parked in the dark at the end of Thomas's drive at 1:30. What followed was slow. It is always slow. That's the part the stories leave out. The waiting, the paperwork, the way the machinery of justice grinds so fine you can barely see it moving. A forensic team came to the property in April. They worked under the porch for 2 days. They found soil disturbance consistent with something having been buried and then removed, likely decades prior. They found a woman's earring, small and gold, pressed into the clay 3 feet from where the tin box had been. They found, in the root cellar beneath the barn, a place Thomas had not known existed, a place Rex had circled every single day for 3 weeks before Thomas finally followed him. A collection of Margaret Pratt's belongings that had been stored there. Her clothing, her books, her teaching materials, a journal. The journal was evidence. Thomas was not permitted to read it, but the detective, a woman named Calloway, younger than Thomas expected, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to let cases become personal and failed at it anyway, told him, months later, that the journal made clear Margaret Pratt had been afraid, that she had documented things, that she had apparently told someone, that someone had not come forward in 1989, that someone came forward now. An elderly woman from the next county over, 81 years old, who had been Margaret's friend and had carried 35 years of guilt like a stone in her chest. She said Margaret had told her she was leaving Earl. She said she had believed, when Margaret disappeared, that Margaret had simply left, had finally done what she said she was going to do. She had wanted to believe that, because the alternative was something she couldn't live with. Earl Pratt was dead. Whatever he knew or did or failed to do, he had taken it with him in February, and the law has limits on what it can do with the dead. There was no arrest. There was no trial. There was, in the end, only the truth, partial, incomplete, the way truth usually is. Margaret Elaine Pratt was declared legally deceased in July. A memorial was arranged by a niece in Lexington whom Margaret had lost touch with decades ago, who cried on the phone when Detective Calloway called her and said she had always wondered. Thomas went to the memorial. He did not know why exactly. He had never met Margaret. He had only seen her face in photographs, only held the evidence of her life in his hands by accident, only found her because a dog had refused to let a secret stay buried. He stood at the back of a small chapel in Harlan County and thought about the particular stubbornness of truth, how it waits, how it finds a way, how sometimes it takes 35 years and a retired school teacher and a gray-muzzled German shepherd digging in the dark. Thomas is still on the farm. He fixed the porch, replaced the rotting lattice with cedar boards, the same wood as the chest that held Margaret's things, though he didn't plan it that way. He planted a rose bush at the far left corner, where Rex first dug. A yellow one. He wasn't sure why yellow. It seemed right. Rex is older now. The gray has spread from his muzzle to his brow, and he sleeps longer and harder than he used to. And sometimes Thomas watches him sleep and thinks about what it means to carry something faithfully for a long time and finally be allowed to put it down. Some wounds don't fully close. You learn to work around them. You learn that the land you stand on has a memory, and sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you're willing to dig, it will tell you things you needed to know. Thomas told me once, and I want you to hear this because it's the part that stays with you after everything else fades. He said that the strangest part of all of it wasn't what he found. It was that Earl Pratt had kept it, had buried it carefully, had preserved it through decades of silence and guilt, and whatever private accounting he did with himself in the long years after Margaret was gone. He couldn't tell it, Thomas said, but he couldn't destroy it either. He left it for someone who could. He left it for the land, and the land gave it to a dog. And the dog gave it to a man who had come to that place because he too had things he hadn't figured out how to carry yet. Sometimes the stories find the right person. Sometimes the truth waits until it has someone worthy of it. Before you go, if this story sat with you, if you found yourself somewhere in Thomas, or in Rex, or in the patience of a truth that refused to disappear, then you already know what this channel is. We don't make noise here. We tell the stories that deserve to be told. Subscribe. That's all. Just subscribe, so the next one finds you. One last thing. This story is fiction, but what it's built on is real. According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, there are currently over 600,000 active missing persons cases in the United States. Approximately 4,400 unidentified remains are recovered every year. Many cold cases from the 80s and 90s are being solved today because of advances in forensic DNA technology. Cases that sat untouched for 30, 40, 50 years. If a story like Margaret's feels familiar, it may be because it is. The names change, the land doesn't.
So anytime you stop me, you want your back up,